So one of the things that I think we need to do, of course, is we need a more robust and, if you will, capacious account of tradition than most of us have, right? So I think it was C.S. Lewis who famously said, those who appeal to tradition generally have in mind the period immediately prior to their own, right? So we have to recognize that tradition is a much more dynamic category, right? It's the handing on and reception of the faith which has taken place since the first disciples began to preach the good news and share the story of how Christ had changed their lives. That tradition did not originally take place in terms of doctrine. We didn't start out with creeds. The Nicene Creed doesn't come until centuries later. That tradition started out largely as story and ritual. Story and ritual, telling the story of Jesus, telling the story how the risen Christ had changed their lives, and giving ritual expression to that as a Christian community. Doctrine would gradually play a role, and it plays different kinds of role as tradition develops. But that tradition is dynamic. We believe the Spirit works through it, but it also has multiple, to use the language of John Thiel, multiple senses. There are different aspects of tradition. So John Thiel wrote this wonderful book called The Senses of Tradition, and he says, well, there's one sense, we might call it the literal sense or the stable sense. We might think here of church dogma, those fundamental commitments that are the bedrock features of our tradition. And they'll develop too. They'll grow, they'll change, but they'll be marked by a high degree of consistency, right? And then he's going to talk about another aspect of tradition, which is development and continuity. And this is where there really is change. One thinks of some of the Marian dogmas, but we can look back and kind of connect the dots and see how here's where we are, but I see how we got there from looking back to the tradition. Now, the Second Vatican Council affirms both of those senses, I think, real clearly. Theologians today are more and more saying we also need to affirm two other elements of tradition, and I think Pope Francis is honoring this more than his predecessors did. John Thiel says there's a third sense. So if the first is a stable sense of tradition, and the second is a sense of tradition developing dynamically and organically, the sort of flowering of insights, you know. The third he calls dramatic development, which is a kind of a politically correct way of saying reversal. That is to say that sometimes the church has had to reverse itself in some of its traditions. I mentioned usury. One could mention slavery. One could mention the common teaching in the church that women are subordinate to men on the order of nature because they're insufficiently rational. These were all accepted. I am not asserting this. This is a teaching that I'm happy to say has been reversed within our tradition, right? So there's also tradition, elements of tradition that have reversed, or as he puts it, dramatically developed, not organically developed. But then he speaks of a fourth, incipient development. This is the role for the prophetic. This is the role for the voices that appear at a new point in history that are saying something that we hadn't heard before. One thinks of maybe Christian pacifism, or people who began to challenge initially the abolitionists, for example. They were challenging the received tradition of the church. People heard this as something new, and however much we don't think so now, it was viewed as untraditional, right? Those who began to challenge capital punishment. Initially, that was an incipient development, a prophetic voice that gradually wins the day in terms of modern papal teaching and finds its way into the catechism. But so when we talk about tradition, I think we have to have a much more subtle and differentiated understanding of the many dimensions of tradition and the way in which that tradition has really, up until the modern period, given ample space to vigorous debate and disagreement, right? I mean, it's really interesting. I mean, we think that people are raucous now, but there's this wonderful account of the First Vatican Council in 1869 and 1870, in which one of the theological disagreements was so contested that one of the bishops went over and yanked on the beard of one of the other bishops to get him to shut up so he could talk, you know? So tradition has to have a place. I'm not advocating that, by the way, at all. But our sense of tradition sometimes is, I think, too romantic. Too pious, well, we've always held this, and it's not recognized. The tradition, as Alistair McIntyre puts it, is a long living argument, right? a good argument about things that matter to you and me, but an argument